welcome to everyone. Great introduction. Extraordinary hearing all about this notion of the magnetic city. We have an amazing panel of people who I've just heard what's in their inboxes this morning. Just that would be enough for us to talk about all day, and we'll be picking up some of those themes. But I'd like to welcome the panel to the stage. So it's going to be the same format as yesterday. We're going to rattle through some really great questions here, but it's really important that you get involved and you think of the questions you want to ask. It'll be up here with Spot Me, and I'll also be passing around the mic again to take lots of questions from the floor. We'll start with Michael Münter, because he's sitting in the city of Stuttgart, who's dealing with tons of the things that already we were talking about yesterday. Some extraordinary numbers, some extraordinary issues. And oddly, a man who seemed very calm this morning when I spoke to him about what's happening in that city. Michael, let's rattle through a little bit of statistics, because first of all, you had an amazing number that challenged what we heard about in Los Angeles. How many of the people in your city are migrants?
In the city of Stuttgart, we have about 40% of the population who have a migration background, and on the people below 18, there are 60% of the pupils with a migrant background, and under the age of 6, there are 80% with a migrant background in Stuttgart.
And this is a successful German city which has done amazing work on inclusion. And you're expecting how many people to arrive this year? Do you have any notion? How many have arrived so far?
At the moment, we're about heading up to 5,000 refugees who are in the city at the moment, and we are trying to accommodate them. At the end of this year, we are expecting about 6,000 to 6,500, and at the end of next year, we are calculating up to 10,000.
And what does inclusion look like in a German city? I was saying that it's extraordinary when you get off the train in Munich. If you arrive there at the moment, they're preparing for Oktoberfest. So every stall in the Hauptbahnhof is taken over by selling dirndls and lederhosen. And you wonder what the notion of real inclusion in Germany is about. Do you think it is that you get right into deep German culture, or it's that you support the football team, or that you get access to what does it look like to be a migrant who feels, actually, this is my home?
Well, I can only reflect mostly on the Stuttgart experience, and we are working on two things. One is language, and the second is work. So we are trying very early to getting people into learning the German language. So, for example, the pupils who are coming to us, who are being refugees, they are going to school from the first day on. So we are really starting to schooling them from the first day. We have created what we call balcony classes, so they are going to regular schools, but not in the regular classes, but they are going to something that we call balcony classes. We are trying very hard to getting the other people into German language courses, so that they are really becoming familiar with the language. And the other thing is work. So after a period of time, we're trying also to get the refugees into work. It's not that simple. There are some barriers, many barriers, but we're trying to do it. And this is what we see, the inclusion aspect on the refugee side.
Ibone has been working here in the city administration and then also now for the government of Biscay. You've done extraordinary work. But what's the magnetic pull of this region? Because yesterday we were just talking to the city government. They were saying there's some anticipation that maybe 1,000 people will come to this region. Planning being done, no one arrived at the moment. But you've already been through this experience during the wars in Yugoslavia. Many people who are Bosnians came here. Do you think this is a city, a region that is open, that can embrace these people?
Yeah, I think that the Basque country itself, and so Biscay and so Bilbao, were quite an open society, and it's because we have suffered the drama of having to go abroad when there was a Spanish Civil War. So I think that solidarity is inside our hearts, but that must be prepared. Considering two axes, one of them should be from disparity to diversity management. I don't like usually to talk about inclusion, because inclusion is where do you include people in your way of understanding your life. I like to speak about managing diversity, and diversity can be because of a wide range of reasons, because of race, because of gender, because of unemployment, because of studies, economical, technology gap even. So I think that we are trying to develop, not yet, we can do it better, a way of managing that diversity. There is an asset, I mean, the hardware of the city and of the region is quite well done. But the software, I mean, the way that people feel that they are part of a bigger community, so we are Basque, but you are from, I don't know where, but from the USA, and then you can be
I'll
here
be telling everyone where it's
and
from,
be
don't worry.
part of the Basque country, and then you come from Germany, and then if we can manage that properly, I will feel much more German and much more American, and then you will feel much more Basque, and that's making community. And the second one is the X in which you've got government and then governance. The worst point of the government should be like a dictatorship, and then the best one in the governance should be leadership in which you can make people commit with a common shared view of what you want for your city and for the region. I don't know if we have done it yet, really not, but we've got the aspiration, and it's good to have aspiration. So how are we going to manage that? I think that having a big social supporting net, for example, more than half of the budget of the regional government is for social supporting net for everyone, regardless the origin, regardless the situation. And secondly, because we are trying to work in good governance. And that good governance can be in public-public collaboration, public stakeholders, or in this case with the refugees, the third sector collaboration, social associations, and the third one should be the collaboration with citizenship. So in public-public collaboration, there is a strength in which the different levels of government are defining which are the needs of those people with those specific vulnerability. Secondly, which are the needs of the people living already in the region so that they can accept and they can commit with people coming. And thirdly, work closely with the third sector and communicate to the citizenship so that they don't feel afraid. That should be the strategy.
Thank you very much. Jeff Johnson has a very long CV, and I think if you've looked at his entries, he's done many extraordinary things. He currently runs a company called JIJ Communications, and he advises lots of cities on how they tell their stories and much more besides. Jeff, we were alluding to people's inboxes this morning. Without revealing too much, could you just tell us a snapshot of the incident that you, for example, had to dive in on this morning?
No, there is a city, and there are plenty of cities over the last 24 hours that are dealing with the shooting deaths of children. And so, we were just talking in both in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh in the last 48 hours, 3-year-olds have been killed. Some intentionally, some in crossfire. And so I think there are many urban cities in America that are constantly dealing with how are we not just managing issues of violence, because I think that sometimes is the problem. Communications professionals like me are asked to come in and help mayors explain why a 3-year-old got shot. And then what are the police doing to address it? Versus as we deal with the law enforcement aspect of what needs to be done in that environment, how are you ultimately dealing with the ecosystem that ensures that a 3-year-old doesn't get killed? And especially in a city like Cleveland, where you are navigating this unique environment of looming trials for police officers who shot a 12-year-old, while you're simultaneously dealing with an incredibly violent community. That's not solved either through police reform or through arresting a gang member. That's solved through how is the city in a complex way looking at the ecosystem of poverty. How are you dealing with issues of education and opportunity? And then how are you, in a larger way, elevating the stakeholders in that process? So it's not just public and private. So it's not just the Cleveland Foundation, which I think does an amazing job in the city of Cleveland, being involved in addressing some of these issues as the largest community foundation in the world. But there are small businesses and large businesses that have an economic stake in a safe and educated Cleveland. And when we start talking about globalized cities, it's not always just about how are you dealing with immigration and how are you welcoming people into cities and ensuring that you're providing opportunity. Real global cities prepare global leaders. And so if we're not looking at the least of those as the recipients of the kind of education and preparation that prepare them to be able to compete anywhere in the world, we're not truly a global city.
And just very quickly, when you go to city halls and when you speak to mayors, this notion of joining up these dots, because this is extraordinary. The end point of non-inclusion is a child dead on the street. Now, when you go to City Hall, are there people thinking, okay, let's think about this. This is a business strategy. This is an education strategy. This is all our social services. This is more than thinking it's a policing issue. There's been extraordinary headlines out of the US over the last 2 years. Is that mindset changing in city halls?
Some it's changing, and some it's not moving at all. So I think it depends where you are. I think there's some incredibly progressive cities with mayors that actually believe they are serving human beings versus numbers. And then I think that there are some who are so entrenched in white supremacy that they just believe things should stay the same, and in fact that people that are killing each other in urban communities are doing us a favor. So I think that you have a vast chasm of thought around that issue, just like you have different thought around how sophisticated as a mayor or city council you want to be in addressing these issues. Because I think data will show you that you can still be very myopic and have small impact. And that small impact for them is enough to drive fundraising for the next campaign. But those that truly want to have long-lasting impact are having to think larger, are having to include more people in the solution process, and be a little bit more sophisticated in how they're solving problems.
Kevin, let's bring you in, and let's not make this a too dark a conversation this morning, but just that same snapshot. You had a story to deal with this morning, a real tragedy to deal with. Just tell us, people, what the end point of that non-inclusion for you was this morning.
Yeah, I think very similar to what Jeff was talking about. 4 o'clock this morning, local time, we had a triple shooting in a neighborhood which involved 2 minors. The worst part about it was it was an occasion. The family was there for the 1-year anniversary of another kid that was shot. And while they were standing there to release balloons, some of the gangbangers came by and inflicted further harm. So, for us, this is the work we came here to do. I know personally, having grown up in Pittsburgh, we have some great things happening, with our innovation. Our mayor is very progressive, but we have whole neighborhoods in our city that have been disinvested for 70 years, largely around the issue of race. We're really trying to tackle, the legacy of the last multi-hundred years in the United States. And cities increasingly are the vehicles through which this change can happen. When you look at Washington and even in Harrisburg, which is our state capital, the gridlock between the traditional political parties, they're not getting it done. And really, it's empowering to come to here we are in Bilbao, which is another very similar city to our own, to hear common themes and hear common problems and common solutions. So I think that the story of this new century is really us as cities coming together and tackling these problems. Specific to Pittsburgh, it's opportunities. It's breaking down barriers.
This conversation we were hinting at, you're having this conversation, you're in the mayor's office tomorrow and you say, okay, this cannot go on.
Yeah.
You have to do what? Because you've already been pretty successful at changing around the city. You're known as a technology hub. Mm-hmm. You've created new industry. You're providing greater employment. Mm-hmm. But what are the barriers for really changing this narrative?
Is making sure that new economy is available for everyone to participate. That is very clearly You know, as we grow as a city, 20, 30 years ago, we had a depression with the decline of the steel industry. For those other American cities here, you know, the Steelers travel very well because we lost a whole population of residents. Steeler Nation is really folks who left our town when we lost our mills. But, you know, with the growth of Carnegie Mellon, we've reinvented ourselves. You know, the human capital and the intellectual capital that's being spun out is attracting companies and employers back to Pittsburgh. Our challenge is to make sure that those jobs and those economic activities are available, you know, for everybody. And in terms of, you know, that takes investments in our education systems, you know, really getting to the point of what has caused the systemic decline of neighborhoods for kids to grow up and not being able to participate in those economic challenges. And that's really what, you know, our approach has been as a city is, I chair our redevelopment authority. All of our efforts are moved towards, you know, bringing that to neighborhoods and providing those opportunities for kids to grow and to have work opportunities.
Let's bring Tonya in. Do you think I wonder if I'm asking the wrong question, though, because it's great you go and bang on the mayor's desk and say, oh, this is terrible, we need something to be done. But this is falling into the trap of thinking the top can solve all the problems at the bottom or lower down in the communities, in these networks. Is it the job of all of us here to be saying, actually, what we need is empowered leaders in those communities so that the conversation is running in the other direction? Because it feels to me so often when we have these conversations, we're still falling into those old ways of thinking there is this all-powerful mayor who has all the ideas and he's going to be the one who, or she is going to be the one who decides every single thing. But what are we doing about leadership in the communities? And that comes through education. You know, give us a snapshot of, you know, what Skillman would want to do.
Yeah, so the Skillman Foundation is a children's foundation in Detroit, and our big investment over the last 10 years is that we've been working in 6 of the largest and poorest communities in the city of Detroit. And what we believe, like the biggest game changer in these communities is that the citizenry in those communities must define the future for itself. They must guard and create the kind of culture that they want to have in those communities. They have to help create safety. Now, we're not asking these communities to do the job of government, and I think that was a big challenge in a place like Detroit. And if there are other cities that have experienced bankruptcy, it is so easy to devolve or to delegate responsibilities of City Hall to communities. But we have to figure out how you have some shared responsibility in this work. And what we found by doing this, quite honestly, as much as we invest in education reform and fixing schools and doing all those different things, we find that the community leaders set the culture. They set the culture and the expectation for young people if they're going to graduate from high school or if they're going to go to college. And so when we look at where we've built community leaders versus communities where we haven't built community leaders, but we've also made investment in schools, we're seeing that these communities have upward of 20% more growth in high school graduation, and they have doubled the number of young people who are going to college. And that's because we need everybody's voices in this. And I think that's what diversity and inclusion or diversity management is about. It's about not just trying to figure out how you put these cogs in the wheel. It's not about how you make them fit into your system. It's really about how you create a system where people's voices and they have matter and that they have an ability to influence what the system actually looks like and what it will do.
Jeff, just to quickly bring you on this one. You've done so much about leadership, empowering people. And I said yesterday, I think Jeff asked a question that no European community leader would ever ask in this setting. How do you make black millionaires, in effect? How do you make business leaders from the community who have generational wealth? I've never, ever, ever heard that question asked in a European context. It's refreshing to see this notion of really empowering people, of changing the whole story. For you, how does that change this notion of community leadership, that it should be top up and bottom down, both ways, that there should be someone listening, but there should be some real people in the community that are not divisive figures, but they are empowering characters?
Well, I think more than a methodology, I think it's about redefining what diversity and the end game of diversity and inclusion. because I think that we've got activists that have been extremely aggressive and to some degree effective in challenging municipalities to look differently about inclusion, and whether that's the migrant community, whether that's immigrants, whether that's people of color. But so often it's still, the conversation never moves beyond access. And I'm not interested in the first black anything. I'm interested in how do people of color access power? How are we talking about not just being able to get a job somewhere, but how are we dealing with issues of ownership and equity? And so I think that less from a methodology of how are we having conversations, I think that is part of the litmus that should determine success. So, and it's not an either-or proposition. So I think that cities that are becoming incredibly effective have ecosystems that say, how do we create on-ramps for people to have opportunity? But on the other end of the spectrum, how are we having pipelines that are leading to equity and management and ownership and wealth creation? And if we're not doing both, then we're really paying lip service to what I think inclusion means.
I see all five of you want to dive in quickly, Michael.
I think perhaps I can share a good example or a good practice from Stuttgart, what we did at that aspect. A couple of years ago, we realized that the city administration is not as diverse as the city is regarding the migration background. For example, most of the people who are working at the city administration are coming to the city administration via an apprenticeship. But the number of people who have a migration background accessing this apprenticeship were only 10%. And then a couple of years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago, one of my divisions, which is dealing with migration and integration, they set up a program which is called Your City, Your Future, which is aiming directly at migrants getting into the city administration. For example, there are, I think, 2 or 3 newspapers in Turkish who has been being published in Stuttgart. There was completely no-go area for the city administration before. Now we are advertising our apprenticeships in these Turkish-spoken newspapers. And in the last year, for the first year, we really managed to have 47% of all apprentices coming with a migration background, which is exactly the figure it is between the 18 to 20-year-olds. So this is a kind of a good practice example. It took about 5 or 6 or 7 years, but now we have many people with a migration background starting their apprenticeship in the city administration and growing through and growing into the city administration.
Just on this global cities, business solving these problems. So, there you've put the finger on business and said, you need to do something about this. You need to help us fix this problem. We can't do it all in City Hall. And they responded?
Yes, they responded, but I think, as you know, we have 3 very, very large enterprises in Stuttgart. This is Porsche, Daimler, and Bosch. And they are international companies. So they are really hiring for their apprenticeships, for their studying. They are hiring people with migration background because that is quite used to they're quite used to doing this. The small scale businesses, we are talking with them. That's not that simple. Nevertheless, we as a city administration, we say, well, we have to give a good example that we are doing it, because often it is the city administration says to the businesses, says to the NGOs, says to whoever this and that, and if you're looking to yourself, you say, well, okay, we haven't done that. So at the moment, we can say we managed it, and you can do it as well.
Ibone, let's bring you back in here. I know you're not in city administration now, you're with the government of Biscay, but what does a global city actually even mean? What does it mean for you in a sense of when you were in Bilbao? Is it this? Is it working with these big international companies? Because in a way they set the agenda. They can change the narrative of social inclusion. They can change the narrative of what people paid. They can give people ambitions. Is it a business story for you being a global city? Or is it this inclusive notion? Just give us a snapshot of what you see that as the answer.
I think that it's like a vision. I mean, Bilbao. Bilbao, we think it's very big, but it's small. We are a global city. And what's that for us? To be a global city is to be in relationship with people all over the world who have similar problems to what the problems we are having, and even they may have problems that we will have in the future. So it's to take advantage of the knowledge of others who are facing challenges successfully that we will have to succeed later. That's the vision.
Tonya, tell me, when you were here in Bilbao, so Bilbao is a city that has done an amazing thing. It's charted this change from heavy industrial city to a contemporary city with tech industries, with a nice veneer of tourism, brings in money for all sorts of people. When you look at Detroit and when you look at its transition, are you thinking in 20 years' time we'll look out the window and this will be the kind of vision you see of the investment in arts, the investment in public art in every square, the re-engineering of the city for a modern economy? Do you feel that we're on that journey? We all know the story of Shinola, a great story, but are there another 20 Shinolas waiting in the wings to help you make that change?
Yes, I think there are new and many more Shinolas waiting in the wind. I think that our responsibility as a city, in order to get to this place of recovery, is that we have to build out the ecosystem that allows us to have entrepreneurs who can access capital. And so that's one of the things, Detroit, like many other industries, where cities, you're built on these kind of single industry places. And so what we've done is actually, over the last 7-8 years, is spent time investing in how you support people who have ideas, who want to bring those ideas to market, and knowing that we have to have an inclusive approach to that, because in the United States and in Detroit in particular, the people who are going to hire, the people who create businesses hire people who are like them. And so if we really want everybody to participate in the prosperity of a region, then we need to make sure that everybody is an owner, right? Everybody has to be able to create what's there for them. But I think one of the things that one of the challenges we're gonna face in Detroit as we think about creating a vision like Bilbao has and creating the investments is to believe or to challenge ourselves to not get caught in this trap that in order to recover, you have to take shortcuts. You have to take a shortcut and say that we're going to recover, and we're so desperate for any capital that we don't think about inclusive recovery, that we don't think about how we engage everyone. So Detroit, like many other cities, when you get to this recovery place, you're looking at our city core, our downtown, and what we call an area, which is Midtown, and they're growing by leaps and bounds, and everybody's excited about it. And there's always this belief that it's going to trickle over into the other neighborhoods that are disadvantaged or disinvested. And that doesn't happen organically. It has to only happen intentionally. And I don't think that we've yet to do that in Detroit. And it's our next journey.
Kevin, many people, when they look at your city, they think you have done it. Have you done it?
We're on our way. And I think the 2 points I'd like to make to follow up on your point, when that economic activity happens and comes into a disadvantaged neighborhood, we're trying to prevent that from happening in a way that gentrifies and pushes people out, because that's not success.
Or that you just have people driving to work in the nice new factory and then driving back to the communities they came from, which happens all the time.
Absolutely. So our approach is to stay ahead of that, to make investments. Right now we have a bit of an affordability crisis in Pittsburgh. We're looking to recreate some of the tools in our toolbox to maintain that the folks that have lived through the hard times in some of these neighborhoods can share in the growth, and that takes investments in home ownership. Making sure people, from an economic empowerment standpoint, can grow along with that neighborhood. The other point I'd like to make in terms of the economic empowerment, we talk about millionaires, and that point was made when we were negotiating with the Penguins hockey team on this 28-acre development. And what we did was create somewhat of an empowerment zone that we would capture the tax increment to be generated on this site in Pittsburgh, 28 acres right in the middle of our city, and really invest that in the Hill District, which is our predominantly African-American neighborhood in the city. But it also, if you look at the city as a consumer, we procure millions of dollars every year. Most of those contracts are RFP, they're huge. We have people in Pittsburgh of color and women-owned businesses that can't compete with that, and maybe prior administrations like that because they like to award contracts that people could afford campaign donations. We're looking to break down those barriers, break up those contracts. Just last week, the mayor announced an effort to have those RFPs posted online, So churches, neighborhood groups, entrepreneurs can start to become a supplier to the city. I'm not a Keynesian economist, but as the city, low-hanging fruit, we spend our dollars and to get that social return of equity by breaking up those dollars and empowering people in our city towards pathways to growth is something that we're trying to tackle.
Let's bring Jeff in here because it's interesting. It's great if you empower all these people to go and set up companies and have good businesses. But then if you can't get a contract from City Hall because it's all done through a network of friendship and we've always done business with so-and-so and that's the way it's done, does that kind of worry you, Jeff, when you think, okay, we're telling all these people to start businesses, go out there and we'll help you, and then they're coming up against these hidden barriers in a way?
Well, I mean, there are traditional ways of doing business, and I think that the cities that are becoming the most successful, I mean, so in Baltimore, the city that I live in, you've got unbelievable development in certain parts of the city, and it's beautiful and it's shining, and people can't wait to get there. And then less than several blocks, you've got block upon block upon block upon block of blight. And the companies that are growing in Baltimore aren't relying all on contracts from the city. But there has to be, where Baltimore is failing, and I think where there's an opportunity, and I think what we're beginning to see in a small way start to work, is business incubators and accelerators that are trying to create a business ecosystem that says whether these are contracts directly from the city or whether these are companies that we're bringing together to be able to do more business and compete for business even outside of the city, but bringing tax-based dollars back to the city of Baltimore, how are we thinking differently about how we grow businesses? And so part of that is about city engagement, because if you've got small-sized companies, and these aren't just Black-owned or Latino or minority-owned companies. I mean, these are just small and mid-sized companies that have some capacity issues. How do you create accelerators that bring companies together where you can make double and triple the profits working together to bid for contracts, whether that's with the city or whether that's for contracts outside of the city? And so I think the cities that I'm seeing successful are creating unique accelerators and incubators that, whether we're dealing with minority-owned businesses or not, are talking about how do we target mid-size and small-size companies and deal with increasing their capacity. And I think cities that are able to do that not only solve a problem of increasing the capacity of minority-owned businesses, but you're talking about increasing the capacity of all of your businesses to do business not only with the city, but creating a stronger ecosystem of companies that can compete outside of the city as well.
Michael, we were talking about the notion of global cities. I just want to jump back to brand Germany a bit. I think one of the most amazing turnarounds is that one of those movies where you think the baddie is going to get it and you suddenly turns out he's the good guy. Because all summer we thought that Germany and its cities were the most miserable people for the way they dealt with the Greeks. And everyone was like, oh my God, what is it with the Germans? What's their problem? And then 4 months later, the narrative is completely changed. And for brand Germany in the world, it's been an extraordinary turnaround in fortunes, in people's perceptions, and of the people. You can see how people are voting with their feet. 850,000 people, given the option of where to sit down in Europe, are choosing Germany. They want to come to Germany or Sweden. They're only two countries they're really heading for, because you have a welcome mat, you have an inclusion process. But more than that, let's just talk about brand Germany, what it's going to do for you.
Well, basically, it is very good for the brand Germany, of course, but it also poses some very, very strong questions to the country, because the brand is something that is seen from the outside. But there are citizens living there, and also in Stuttgart, there are people who are afraid of 10,000 refugees in our city. And we are working very, very hard. This is a liberal city, an open-minded city, but we have to work very hard to get that mood going. And we also have this not in my backyard mentality also in Stuttgart. Everyone says, well, I'm not against refugees, definitely not, but well, you're going to build refugee housing just beside my garden. Well, you know, I'm not against refugees, but. So this is also happening. So for the brand Germany, this is quite very good, of course. I'm absolutely
just
right.
tell me, and I think it's surprising where the resistance. I was explaining I was in Germany last week, and I was in Munich, and I met lots of nice white liberal Germans who were handing out sandwiches, and end of story, done. But when I got in a taxi with a Turkish driver who'd been there 20 years, he said, I hate this situation. I don't want these people here. It's putting me, every time someone gets in the taxi, they're saying, when did you arrive? 2 weeks ago. And he's like, I've been here 20 years. I didn't arrive 2 weeks ago. And he didn't like the narrative. He felt that he was suddenly thrown back into the story of the new arrivals. Do you think it's oddly that, you know, the resistance doesn't always come from where you think it comes from? You've got to bring along the existing migrant communities. You've said you've already got a hugely diverse city. The challenge is not always where you think.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's the same situation in Stuttgart. I think you can also have a cab in Stuttgart with a Turkish driver or with an Armenian driver or wherever or whatever, and he will tell you probably the same story. Yes, this is something we are dealing with. I think our city, my city, has a long tradition of getting done with the things and doing it in a quite sensible and mindful way. But there are really many tasks ahead, and we have to to take the population in the city, which means the residents which are with German passport and the residents with not a German passport with us to say, well, we want to remain a liberal and open-minded city. And on the other hand, there is also a situation where Germany can't take all the refugees in Europe. As you mentioned, you were in Munich at that time, and there were situations or people who are now stuck in Austria, and they say, "Well, I'm stuck in Austria. What would I do in Austria? I want to go to Germany." If everyone, we have to come to any kind of organization in the European Union.
This is the downside of magnetism. We were talking
Absolutely.
about this is literally the downside of magnetism, because Austria has no magnetism. So during that period, it's true. During that period, the number of people going through Vienna, guess how many people asked for asylum? 24. 24 people officially asked for asylum during the peak week of people coming across Europe. 24 people, 850,000 people tried to go to Germany. So there is a downside of magnetism. You've got to manage that as well.
Yes, and this is the task that we are doing. We talked earlier about it, that the city of Stuttgart invested during the last 2 years about 150 to 180 million euros only in the construction of the ready-built houses for the refugees. 150 to 180 million euros, because we are building most of them new. So, this is quite, even for a city like Stuttgart, which is a rich city, this is a huge task. And you all the time have kinds of, there are people in the normal social problem situations in Stuttgart that are telling you, well, we have problems and now the refugees coming, they are getting a television, they are getting a new house, and we are suffering under this and that conditions. So these are things that you as a city administration have to deal with.
Now, I did promise I would stay roughly on schedule. We are going to run like 5 minutes over, because I think people have just asked answered such good questions. But we're going to open it up now to the floor. And if you haven't got lots of questions after that, nothing will get you going. But the coffee is coming soon as well. So we're going to open it up for Spot Me as well. I don't know if anyone's got the iPad for me to take the Spot Me. And we're also going to be taking questions from the floor. So let's just recap. If this isn't the story of inclusion in American cities, in European cities, the challenges, the complexities of it, the role of industry, the role of education, the role of transport, these are all the things that have surfaced this morning. really tough challenges. And here are the people, literally their inboxes this morning dealing with, 5,000 new migrants, child shot on the streets. These are the issues that all face us in how we run our cities. So I hope there's some really very good questions. So let's take a question from the floor first. Who would like to go first? Come on, be brave. The gentleman here, please. Could we get the microphone quickly? And just if you could just say your name so everybody can know where you're from.
Thank you. My name is Tony Silverfeld. I'm at the Bertelsmann Foundation in Washington, D.C. I had a question to follow up on some comments that Michael made about balcony classes. And we're doing a lot of work now in Boston and in Athens, Greece, on inequality issues. And I wondered, from a practical perspective, what has been the outcome from this balcony classes initiative, both from the educational attainment perspective and also when it comes to social inclusion?
We only have very short period of time since we are doing it. It's about 12 to 15 to 18 months or so. But the basic result is that most of the people after, let's say, a year or so, they can attend the normal school classes in inverted commas. So the balcony class isn't intended to being a balcony class until the end of the road, but it's a balcony class for about, let's say, 1 year or 1.5 years to get the people used to the system, how it works in Germany, and then getting them to the normal classes. So as we only run it for about 16 to 18 months, we haven't kind of results like 50% doing their Abitur, 50% doing their high school, and so on. So, and of course, people are opting out of it. People are getting back to their countries. So it's kind of a situation where we are just working at it. But as far as I know, for the moment, most of the people after about 1 year, they are going to the normal classes.
We'll take one from SpotMe. David Carter asked a question which is about magnetic cities and asking for a city to be truly magnetic. Does its population have to be growing?
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear others answer this question too, but I don't think it has to be growing. But I think it has to be, I think you have to curate that population into the vision that you want it to be. So I think you have to stabilize it. You have to create an opportunity for new people to come in, that there's some diversity, that there's some mixing of people in order to be a magnetic place. I think that eventually, if you're magnetic, people are going to come to you. But I don't think that that has to be your aspiration. I think your aspiration has to be, how do you be a good city for the people who live here, that it's attractive enough that other people would want to come, that they believe that they're going to have access to opportunity, that they believe that they too will be connected to the economic mainstream. And I think that's the core to any magnetic place, is that people think that they can make a difference.
Where's the graph going in your city?
I think from our perspective, we're becoming a younger city. Pittsburgh we've stabilized our growth. We lost half of our population from 1960 to the early 2000s, but we've stabilized and we're sort of an upward growth. But within that metric, we're becoming younger. There's hopefully we're working towards a greater reducing the disparity of wealth, having more equity in terms of economic. So we're growing economically, but we're not. I think we're the only city in our 10 peer group that actually grew, which is pretty remarkable.
Ibone, you wanted to dive in?
I think it's not a matter of size. First, it's a matter of believing. You must believe that you want to be magnetic. It's an aspiration. Secondly, I think that what makes a city or region magnetic is that you can live a unique experience there. And the experience is always made of people. I mean, it's not only having a beautiful building, as what we have outside, that's good. It's also having a real experience with people who are in that region or in that city. And that is related to having a real and effective leadership, because you have been talking about empowerment, and I really agree, but someone must lead. And for me, it's a pity that the public politicians who have the responsibility, who we have been elected to lead that change, it's a pity if we don't do that. And if we don't do that, someone from the grassroots will do it. And the magnetic city is the one who has the effective political leadership to make people not only align, but also commit with shared visions, making from grassroots to up.
Jeff, I'll bring you both in. I've been told I've got like one more question I'm allowed to after this. But Jeff, very quickly, it's great having magnetic cities, but on the whole, we tend to think of people being pulled to magnetic cities because they're mobile, because that they are young, educated, they've got a degree, they can choose what city they go and live in. Unless we empower all those people, the magnetic cities are only going to pull in one kind of person, aren't they?
I don't know if I agree. I think that magnetic cities understand ecosystem better than anybody else. And they're not looking for, a lot of times, like in any other ecosystem, there might be a shining star within that ecosystem, but that's not what makes it run. And so real magnetic cities are not just attracting innovative tech people. They're attracting teachers that want to teach in a place that believes in really educating young people for a global economy. They're not just attracting sexy new young politicians that want to be in this progressive space. They're attracting parents who want to raise their kids in an environment that has a robust arts community. And so I don't think it's attracting, I think sometimes the press, as a communications person, what we're spinning as the narrative of who's here and why it's sexy and why you want to invest here and what's great about it sometimes looks similar. But when you look underneath, there's a really unique, robust kind of attraction. And I think when the previous question about does a magnetic city have to be growing, I think it has to be evolving. And what you really notice about magnetic cities are they make people who have been there forever excited about still being there, not just make people excited about coming there. And a true magnetic city makes lifers say, wow, I didn't know we could do that. And I think that is what truly defines a magnetic city. Not so much what makes someone in Germany or in Austria say, wow, I want to move to Germany. It's what makes someone who's been in Germany say, I never thought we as a city would be here. And that's what's exciting to me about some of the cities that we're talking about.
Well, the coffee's brewing, but we will take one snappier one. The biscuits are on the plates. The gentleman over here, please. We'll pass you the microphone. If you could say your name again, please.
Thank you. Nathaniel Smith with the Partnership for Southern Equity in Atlanta, Georgia. You talked a lot about the end game of inclusion, which could be, unfortunately, violence or crime. But what I would also encourage, and I wanted to get some feedback about this, is that if you look at it within the context of a continuum, the end game of inclusion could also be equity. Right. And so if we look at it within the equity context, then, going back to Tonya's point about including people in the process that we're actually working with or should be working with versus doing to development as opposed to working with those people, or really focusing a lot on how can we create the structures whereby people can really participate in the decision-making process. So how can we make that end game equity versus the negative outcomes associated with leaving inclusion behind?
Kevin,
great question. And what we did in Pittsburgh when the mayor took office 18 months ago, we hired a new police chief. The last police chief went to prison under the last administration. So we did a national search for a police chief. We actually not only did that through the traditional means, we set up community meetings and really went to the public and said, what do you want to see in a police chief? The mayor was out there in different neighborhoods. He had an idea of what he wanted. It was informed by that public participation, and ultimately the residents of the city had a direct input into the chief we hired, and we're seeing the dividends in the guy who we have who's really trying to reestablish the relationship that we have between the Bureau and the residents, especially in neighborhoods where that we've been talking about. So that was just one example.
Jeff.
But I like your question because for me, one of the things that I think is problematic is that we keep getting leadership from the same places. And so when you start talking about equity, a lot of times we do focus heavily on the business side because there is an economic imperative. But whether I'm looking at Atlanta or whether I'm looking at cities like Baltimore, right now Baltimore is going through a mayoral race. And in lieu of a tragedy that happened through the death of a young man, the current mayor has announced that she's not running. I am deathly afraid of the options available, of those that have announced to run for mayor. And the concern that I have is that there are not legitimate pipelines preparing people to run for office from non-traditional environments. And so I would love to see not just business incubators, but candidate and political incubators that are targeting urban communities, that are targeting migrant communities, that are targeting former felon communities, and saying, how do we begin to prepare you not to just be a candidate? Because what we're seeing, especially in U.S. politics, is even when you begin to see diversity in candidates, you don't see diversity in campaign managers and technology directors and finance directors. And so those kind of incubators start changing the feeder pool of not only who's running for city council and school board and state ledge, but then they change who in 10 years is going to be running for Congress, for governor, for president. But not only that, who's going to be a campaign manager for a presidential campaign, because that person ultimately becomes chief of staff of the White House. And so when you start talking about who's in the room, when decisions are being made, we've got to change how we prepare people to be in those leadership positions. Because when you talked about leadership, if you're not, so often in marginalized communities, you're hoping leaders come, as opposed to creating institutional infrastructure that ensures that they do.
We're going to have to leave. Everyone I can see on the diet wants to add into that discussion. I'd like to thank an amazing panel. The great thing for me coming to Build is you go to so many conferences about cities where people are talking about how a new app might sort something or a bit of technology. These are people, and we can see literally in one instance here, roll up their sleeves to get things done. These are the people who are changing our cities and have really kind of thought about some of the big, powerful issues that Build is about. So I'd like you to give a warm round of applause for our panel today.